Rosamund had sewn 7 pearls into her gloves that evening, one for each year she had waited for Lord Reginald Ashford to finally set a wedding date. She stood near the east wall of the grand ballroom inside the Merchant Exchange Hall, watching the servants carry silver trays between clusters of wealthy traders, shipping magnates, and guild directors who had gathered for the annual Capital Trade Banquet. 300 of England's most powerful commercial families filled the room, dressed in silks and fine wool, their laughter bouncing off marble columns wrapped in ivy garlands. Somewhere behind the string quartet, Rosamund's younger sister Cecilia was adjusting her necklace in a mirror, smiling at her own reflection the way she always did before entering a crowded room. Rosamund took a glass of champagne from a passing tray and pressed her back against the cool stone pillar. She had spent the last 3 weeks going through Reginald's private correspondence, letters tucked between account books, notes sealed with wax she recognized as her own sister's, and one particular ledger entry, dated 6 weeks prior, that transferred controlling shares of Cecilia's modest dowry holdings directly into Reginald's silk import firm. She had read that entry 4 times before the numbers stopped trembling on the page. Tonight, Reginald had requested permission from the banquet chairman to make what he called a personal announcement of great significance. Rosamund already knew what he was going to say. She had known for 11 days, and in those 11 days, she had done something far more dangerous than cry. She had prepared. The clinking of a silver fork against crystal silenced the room. Reginald stepped onto the raised dais at the front of the hall, his dark coat pressed and gleaming, his cravat pinned with a ruby stick pin Rosamund had given him on his last birthday. He smiled at the crowd with the ease of a man who had already rehearsed every word. "Distinguished members of the Guild Assembly, honored families, dear friends," Reginald began, his voice carrying across the marble floor. "I stand before you tonight to share news that will reshape the future of England's silk trade." Rosamund set her glass down on the nearest ledge. "After much consideration and counsel," Reginald continued, turning slightly to gesture toward the side of the room, "I have entered into a new engagement, a union of commerce and companionship, with Miss Cecilia Hargrove." Cecilia stepped forward from behind a group of guests, already wearing an emerald ring on her left hand. She curtsied to the crowd with practiced grace, while murmurs rippled through the ballroom like wind through a wheat field. 300 pairs of eyes turned toward Rosamund. She could feel them, the pity, the scandal, the quiet delight some of them felt at watching a proud woman be brought low. Lady Ashworth, near the fireplace, covered her mouth with her fan. Sir Godfrey leaned toward his wife and whispered something that made her gasp. Reginald looked directly at Rosamund, and his expression carried the faintest edge of triumph. He expected tears. He expected her to leave through the service corridor, the way disgraced women always did, quietly, with her head down. Rosamund straightened her shoulders instead. She walked toward the center of the ballroom floor. Every step was measured, every breath controlled. The crowd parted for her the way water parts around a stone, with no resistance and complete attention. She stopped 10 feet from the dais and looked up at Reginald. "I accept the dissolution of our betrothal," she said clearly enough that every person in the room could hear. "And I thank you for making it public, Lord Ashford. It saves me the trouble of paying the £3,000 breach penalty written into our contract." Reginald's smile flickered. That penalty clause had been his insurance, his guarantee that Rosamund would never leave him first. By breaking the engagement himself in front of 300 witnesses, he had just voided it completely. Rosamund turned away from him before he could respond. Her gaze swept across the ballroom and landed on a figure standing alone near the far corner, half hidden behind a column. Duke Vance of Ashenmere. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a black coat so dark it seemed to absorb the candlelight around him. His face was clean-shaven and angular, and he watched the room the way a hawk watches a field, patient, sharp, and entirely uninterested in being liked. The Tun called him the monster of the seas. He had bankrupted 3 rival shipping families in the last 2 years alone. His merchant fleet controlled 1/3 of England's coastal trade, and every harbor master from Bristol to Hull knew his name the way sailors knew a storm warning. He attended the trade banquet every year and spoke to almost no one. He had no wife, no known heir, and no patience for society's games. Rosamund walked toward him. The murmurs in the room turned into open whispers. "Your Grace," Rosamund said when she reached him. Vance looked down at her. His eyes were gray, and they carried the kind of stillness that made most people deeply uncomfortable. "Miss Hargrove," he replied. His voice was low and unhurried. "I have a proposal," Rosamund said. "My family holds the original Regency-era patents for the inland canal distribution routes between London, Birmingham, and Manchester. Every barge, every lock, every cargo transfer point passes through licenses that bear my name. Mine alone, not my father's, and certainly not Lord Ashford's." Vance's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes shifted. She had his attention completely. "Your fleet dominates the coast," she continued, "but your goods sit in harbor warehouses for weeks because you have no efficient route inland. I am offering you my hand in marriage and full access to those patents, tonight, before this room." The silence in the ballroom was absolute. Vance studied her for a long moment. Then he reached into his coat and produced a fountain pen. "The marriage registry is at the chairman's table," he said. Rosamund extended her gloved hand. Vance took it. Together, they walked across the ballroom floor toward the long oak table where the trade banquet's official documents were kept. The chairman, a stout man named Mr. Pemberton, fumbled with his spectacles as Vance pulled the leather-bound registry toward him and opened it to the next blank page. Reginald stepped down from the dais. "You cannot be serious," he called out, his voice cracking for the first time all evening. Rosamund did not turn around. She watched Vance sign his name in smooth black ink, then took the pen from his hand and signed her own beneath it. The scratch of the nib against parchment was the loudest sound in the room. Mr. Pemberton stared at the page, then at the two of them, then back at the page. This is legally binding," he stammered. "Yes," Rosamund said. "It is." She turned to face the ballroom. 300 guests stared back at her. Cecilia's emerald ring caught the light as her hand trembled at her side. Reginald's face had gone white. Rosamund curtsied to the room with perfect composure. "I wish my sister and Lord Ashford every happiness in their union," she said. "And I look forward to conducting business with any member of this assembly who values reliable trade partnerships." Then she placed her hand on the arm of the most feared man in England and walked out of the grand ballroom without looking back. Behind her, the whispers erupted into a roar. The carriage left London before dawn. Rosamund sat across from Duke Vance in a polished black brougham pulled by 4 grey horses, the Ashenmere crest stamped into the door panel in faded silver. The city thinned around them as the driver turned south onto the Imperial Post Road, cobblestones giving way to packed dirt, gas lamps replaced by the pale orange line of sunrise cutting through low clouds. The smell of coal smoke and sewage faded, and the air turned sharp with dew and freshly turned soil from the farms that lined the road toward the coast. Vance had not spoken since they left the townhouse where Rosamund had spent her last night as an unmarried woman. He sat with one ankle crossed over his knee, reading a shipping manifest by the gray morning light, marking figures in the margins with a pencil stub he kept in his waistcoat pocket. His black coat from the banquet had been replaced by a traveling jacket of dark brown wool, and his boots were scuffed at the toes. The kind of wear that came from walking docks, not ballroom floors. Rosamund broke the silence first. She had never been the sort of woman who waited for permission to speak. "You should know that last night was not impulse," she said. Vance looked up from his manifest. His gray eyes settled on her with the same flat patience she had seen at the banquet. I assumed as much. Women who act on impulse do not carry patent deeds in their reticule. Rosamund opened the small leather case on her lap and spread 3 documents across the seat beside her. Each one bore the heavy wax seal of the Crown Patent Office, dated 1797, and registered under the name Hargrove, her mother's maiden name, which Rosamund had inherited through a direct matrilineal clause that most people in the trade world did not even know existed. "I discovered Reginald's intentions 11 days before the banquet," she said. "His personal clerk left a bundle of correspondence on the wrong desk. Inside were letters between Reginald and my sister dating back 4 months, along with a transfer agreement moving Cecilia's dowry shares into his silk firm. He planned to absorb our family's canal licenses through the marriage merger and then petition the Guild Council to have my patents reassigned to his new household." Vance set the manifest down. "And you let him announce it publicly. I needed him to break the engagement himself. Our betrothal contract contained a £3,000 breach penalty payable by whichever party dissolved the agreement. If I had walked away first, I would have owed him that sum, money I do not have in liquid capital. By allowing him to make his grand declaration in front of 300 witnesses, he destroyed his own leverage." The carriage jolted over a rough patch of road. Rosamund steadied the documents with her palm and continued. "There is something else. Reginald believes my canal patents transfer automatically to whichever household I marry into. He is wrong. The patents are registered under the 1797 Crown Charter, which binds commercial licenses to the individual holder, not the spouse. Even now, married to you, the patents remain mine. I choose who uses them." Vance studied her for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then something shifted at the corner of his mouth, the faintest suggestion of approval, though it never reached a full smile. "You planned every step." "Every single one." He leaned back against the seat cushion and looked out the window at the rolling green countryside. Sheep dotted a hillside in the distance, and a stone church spire rose above a cluster of thatched-roof cottages. "Then let me tell you what I need," he said, "so we are standing on level ground." Rosamund folded her hands in her lap and waited. "My fleet is the largest private merchant operation on the southern coast. 42 vessels. Deep-water cargo ships, coastal traders, 2 dedicated mail packets under Crown contract. I can move goods from Lisbon to Liverpool faster than any competitor in the country." He paused. "But the moment those goods reach the harbour, they sit. My warehouses in Portsmouth are full to the ceiling. I have tea, tobacco, cotton, and Madeira wine stacked in crates with nowhere to go, because every inland route, every canal barge, every lock passage, every transfer depot between the coast and the manufacturing cities is controlled by a network of license holders who answer to the same guild families that have frozen me out for the last decade." "Because you refused to join their cartel," Rosamund said. Vance's jaw tightened slightly. "They wanted a 30% surcharge on every shipment I moved through their system. Not a toll, not a tax, a surcharge, paid directly into a private fund controlled by 4 guild directors, including your former betrothed. I told them I would sooner burn my cargo on the docks. And they called you a monster for it. They called me a monster because I won anyway. I undercut their coastal rates, poached their best captains, and bought 3 of their retiring competitors at auction. But I still cannot move goods inland without paying their price or finding another way." He looked at her directly. "You are the other way." Rosamund held his gaze. "Then here is what I propose. A formal partnership, structured as a marital business compact under the 1803 Trade Marriages Act. I grant your fleet full access to my canal distribution network, every route, every lock, every depot. In return, I receive a 20% equity stake in your shipping enterprise and a seat on your commercial board. We operate as a single entity, no surcharges, no guild middlemen, a direct line from the coast to every major city in England." Vance was quiet for several seconds. The wheels of the carriage turned steadily beneath them, and somewhere ahead, the driver called to the horses as the road curved downhill. 20%, Vance repeated. 20%. And I manage the inland logistics personally. Your captains handle the sea. I handle everything that happens once the cargo touches English soil. He extended his hand across the carriage. Rosamund shook it. His grip was firm and dry, and he held it for exactly 1 second before releasing. "We will reach the coast by tomorrow afternoon," he said, picking up his manifest again. "I suggest you prepare yourself. My operation is not what polite society imagines." Rosamund settled back into her seat and watched the English countryside roll past the window. Green hedgerows, muddy lanes, a farmer leading an ox cart toward a market town. Somewhere behind her, London was already buzzing with the scandal of what she had done. Somewhere ahead, a harbor full of cargo ships waited for the woman who held the keys to every canal in the country. She folded the patent deeds carefully and returned them to her leather case. The game had only just started. The first thing Rosamund noticed about Ashenmere was the noise. She had expected a country estate, stone walls, quiet gardens, perhaps a modest dock at the bottom of a sloping lawn. Instead, the carriage crested the final hill on the coastal road, and she found herself looking down at what could only be described as a small empire built on rock and salt water. The harbor stretched wide below the cliffs, carved into a natural bay where the chalk headlands curled inward like two arms shielding the water from the open channel. Dozens of ships filled the moorings, tall-masted cargo vessels with their sails furled tight, smaller coastal traders rocking gently against the tide, and a pair of heavy barks being loaded by teams of dock workers who moved crates along wooden cranes with ropes and pulleys. The sound of hammering, shouting, and creaking timber carried up the cliff face on the wind and mixed with the cry of gulls wheeling above the water. Above it all, set back from the cliff edge on a wide stone terrace, stood Ashenmere itself. The house was enormous and plain, built from grey Portland stone with tall, narrow windows and a flat roof line that gave it the look of a fortress rather than a gentleman's residence. No decorative columns, no sculpted gardens, just clean, hard lines and a clear view of every ship in the harbor below. Vance stepped down from the carriage first and offered his hand without ceremony. Rosamund took it and climbed out onto the graveled drive, her traveling cloak snapping in the coastal wind. The air tasted of brine and tar, and her hair pulled loose from its pins within seconds. "This is not a country house," she said. "No," Vance agreed. "It is a headquarters." He led her down a steep stone staircase cut into the cliff face, past a guardhouse where two men in oilskin coats logged arrivals in a heavy leather book, and out onto the main harbor wharf. The dock planks were wide and weathered gray, slick with spray. Workers paused to touch their caps as Vance passed, but none of them lingered or fawned. They returned to their tasks immediately, hauling ropes, checking cargo tallies, rolling barrels into the dark mouths of the warehouses that lined the harbor wall. 42 vessels in active service, Vance said, walking her along the wharf toward the largest of the warehouses. 12 more in dry dock for refitting. I rotate the fleet on a 6-week cycle: Lisbon, Bordeaux, the Baltic ports, and 2 crown mail routes to the Channel Islands. Every ship carries a cargo manifest, signed by my harbor master before departure and verified by the port agent on arrival. He pushed open the warehouse doors. Inside, the space was stacked floor to ceiling with wooden crates, each one branded with the Ashenmere crest and a destination code painted in white. Tea from Canton, wine from Porto, bolts of Indian cotton still wrapped in oilcloth. The smell was extraordinary, a dense mixture of dried spice, damp wood, and something sweet that Rosamund guessed was Madeira. "This is one of 9 warehouses," Vance said, "all of them full. Some of this cargo has been sitting here for 3 months because I have no efficient way to move it past Southampton." Rosamund ran her fingers along the edge of a crate stamped for Birmingham. "How much value is stored in this building alone?" "Roughly £12,000 at current market rates. Across all 9 warehouses, closer to 90,000. The number landed in Rosamund's chest like a stone dropped into still water. 90,000 pounds of goods trapped between the sea and the inland cities, losing value every week to spoilage, storage costs, and shifting market prices. She understood now why Vance had signed the marriage registry without hesitation. She was holding the cork in a bottle worth a fortune, and all she had to do was pull it. They spent the next 2 hours walking the harbour complex. Vance introduced her to his harbour master, a weathered Scotsman named Mr. Callum, who kept his records in a ledger so thick it required its own desk. Callum showed her the shipping routes on a large chart pinned to the wall of his office, colored pins marking active voyages, red threads connecting departure ports to destinations, and a cluster of black pins along the southern English coast marking every point where Vance's goods currently sat waiting for inland transport. Rosamund studied the chart carefully. She could already see 3 routes where her canal network could cut delivery times in half. She mentioned this to Callum, who raised his eyebrows and glanced at Vance as though confirming that this woman was allowed to make such observations. "Miss Hargrove manages our inland logistics," Vance said flatly. "Treat her word as mine." Callum nodded once and made a note in his ledger. They climbed back up the cliff stairs as the afternoon light turned golden over the water. Rosamund's legs ached from the steep steps, and her boots were damp with harbour spray. But her mind was already mapping the distribution corridors she would need to open first: the Birmingham Canal, the Manchester Freight Depot, the Thames River barges that connected the southern ports to London's merchant quarter. A rider was waiting at the top of the stairs. He was young, barely out of his 20s, wearing the blue sash of a Guild Council courier. His horse was lathered with sweat, and the leather satchel across his chest bore the official seal of the High Guild Assembly. He handed a folded letter to Vance without dismounting. Vance broke the seal and read the letter in silence. His expression did not change, but his hand tightened around the paper until the edges crumpled beneath his fingers. "What is it?" Rosamund asked. He handed her the letter. She read it twice. The words were formal, written in the clipped language of guild bureaucracy, but their meaning was sharp enough to cut. Lord Reginald Ashford had filed an emergency petition with the High Guild Council, claiming that Rosamund's inland transport permits had become legally void the moment her original betrothal contract was dissolved. He argued that the permits were conditionally tied to her pending marriage into his firm, and that by entering a new marriage without guild approval, she had violated the terms of her commercial licensing. The petition requested an immediate audit of all Hargrove family patents and a temporary freeze on any cargo movement through Rosamund's canal network until the matter was resolved. Rosamund folded the letter carefully and looked out over the harbour, where 90,000 pounds worth of goods sat waiting in wooden crates. "He is fast," she said quietly. "I will give him that." Vance watched her. "Can he win this?" Rosamund tucked the letter into her cloak pocket and turned toward the house. "Only if I let him." The Port Customs House sat at the end of a cobblestone lane that ran straight from the harbour gates to the magistrates' quarter of the town. It was a squat, square building made of red brick, with tall windows filmed over by years of salt air and neglect. Inside, the main hearing room smelled of old ink, lamp oil, and the particular mustiness that collects in places where men argue over money for decades without ever opening a window. Rosamund arrived at 9:30 in the morning, 2 days after the courier had delivered Reginald's petition. She wore a dark green traveling dress with a high collar and her hair pinned tightly beneath a modest bonnet. She carried a single leather portfolio under her arm and walked through the front doors as though she had been entering customs hearings her entire life. Vance walked beside her in his usual black coat, his expression set in the kind of deliberate calm that made other men uneasy. He had said very little that morning. Over breakfast, he had asked her one question: "Do you have everything you need?" And when she had said yes, he had simply finished his tea and called for the carriage. The hearing room held a long oak table at the front where the customs magistrate sat, a thin man named Mr. Aldworth, with deep-set eyes and ink stains on his fingers. Behind him hung a framed portrait of the king and a large maritime chart of the southern coastline. Wooden chairs lined both sides of the room for observers, and most of them were already filled. Harbor clerks, local merchants, a handful of guild agents who had arrived from London on the morning coach. Reginald himself was not present. He had sent his representatives instead, 2 men in expensive grey suits who sat at a table on the left side of the room with a stack of documents between them. The taller one, a solicitor named Mr. Fenwick, had a long face and the particular habit of adjusting his spectacles every time he was about to say something he considered important. Mr. Aldworth opened the proceedings with a dry summary of the petition. Lord Ashford claimed that Miss Rosamund Hargrove's inland transport permits, originally registered under the Hargrove family name in 1797, were conditionally linked to her pending marriage into the Ashford trading firm. The dissolution of that betrothal, followed by her immediate marriage to Duke Vance of Ashenmere, constituted an unauthorized transfer of licensed commercial rights. Lord Ashford requested a full audit of the Hargrove patents and a temporary freeze on all canal cargo movement until the matter was settled. Fenwick stood first. He adjusted his spectacles. "The position of Lord Ashford is straightforward," he began. "Miss Hargrove's canal permits were granted under a family charter that anticipated her integration into the Ashford commercial household. The betrothal agreement, signed in 1816, included a commercial annex specifying that upon marriage, the Hargrove patents would be administered jointly by the combined Ashford-Hargrove enterprise. When Miss Hargrove chose to dissolve that arrangement and enter a separate marriage, she effectively broke the terms under which her permits were expected to operate." He placed a copy of the betrothal agreement on the magistrate's table. "We ask that the permits be frozen until a proper review can determine whether they remain valid under their original charter." Mr. Aldworth examined the document, turning pages slowly. Then he looked at Rosamund. "Mrs. Vance, your response." Rosamund stood. She did not adjust anything. She did not clear her throat. She opened her leather portfolio and removed 3 documents, laying them side by side on the table in front of the magistrate, with the precision of a woman who had rehearsed this moment in her mind 100 times. "The first document is the original Crown patent deed for the Hargrove Inland Canal licenses, granted in 1797 under the reign of King George III. You will note that the patent is registered under the name Hargrove, specifically under the Matrilineal Inheritance Clause of the 1793 Commercial Families Act, which allows patent rights to pass through the female line independent of marriage." Aldworth picked up the document and held it close to the lamp. His eyes moved across the text slowly. "The second document," Rosamund continued, "is the charter amendment filed in 1802, which I retrieved from the Crown Patent Office records in London before departing for the coast. This amendment clarifies that patents registered under the matrilineal clause are bound to the individual holder and cannot be transferred, reassigned, or jointly administered through marriage without the explicit written consent of the patent holder." She paused long enough for Aldworth to pick up the second document. "The third document is a certified copy of my betrothal agreement with Lord Ashford. Mr. Fenwick has already placed his own copy on your table. I invite you to compare them. You will find that the commercial annex he referenced, the one specifying joint administration of my patents upon marriage, is present in his copy, but absent from mine." The room went quiet. Fenwick's hand moved toward his spectacles, but stopped halfway. Aldworth placed the 2 betrothal agreements side by side and examined them carefully. He turned to the final page of each, where the signatures and witness marks were recorded. After a long moment, he looked up at Fenwick. "Mr. Fenwick, the commercial annex in your copy bears no countersignature from Miss Hargrove. It appears to have been appended after the original agreement was executed. Fenwick opened his mouth, closed it, and then opened it again. Lord Ashford's position is that the annex was verbally agreed upon and added as a clarification. Verbal agreements do not amend signed contracts in this jurisdiction, Aldworth said. His voice carried the tired authority of a man who had heard every excuse the merchant class could invent. The patent deeds are clear. The Hargrove Canal licenses are registered to the individual holder under Crown Charter. No marriage, betrothal, or dissolution thereof alters their status. He stamped the hearing record with his official seal and wrote a single line across the bottom of the page. Petition denied. The Hargrove patents remain valid and active. All cargo currently held in Ashenmere Harbour is cleared for inland transport through licensed Hargrove Canal routes, effective immediately. Rosamund gathered her documents and returned them to her portfolio. She did not look at Fenwick or his colleague. She did not smile. She simply closed the leather case, tucked it under her arm, and walked toward the door. Vance fell into step beside her as they crossed the cobblestone lane back toward the harbor. The morning sun had burned through the coastal fog, and the masts of his cargo ships stood sharp against a pale blue sky. "He forged the annex," Vance said. It was a statement, not a question. "He added it 6 months into our engagement," Rosamund replied. "He assumed I would never read my own contract closely enough to notice. He was wrong about that, the same way he was wrong about everything else." Vance glanced sideways at her. "You kept a clean copy." "I keep clean copies of everything." Somewhere behind them, inside the customs house, Mr. Fenwick was already composing a letter to Lord Reginald Ashford. It would not contain good news. Rain came in off the channel that evening and did not stop. Rosamund sat in Vance's private study on the second floor of Ashenmere, a room lined with oak shelves holding bound ledgers instead of novels. A coal fire burned low in the grate, throwing uneven light across the wide desk where she had spread every financial document she could find relating to Reginald's commercial operations. Vance sat across from her in a leather armchair, a glass of port untouched at his elbow, reading through a stack of shipping reports his harbour master Callum had delivered an hour earlier. The customs victory had bought them breathing room. Vance's warehouse crews had already begun loading canal barges with the first shipments of tea and cotton bound for Birmingham, and Rosamund had sent instructions by express post to her canal agents in 3 cities to prepare the lock systems for heavy freight. The gears of their partnership were beginning to turn. But Rosamund knew Reginald would not stay quiet for long. A man who forged contract annexes did not accept defeat gracefully. He would come at them again, differently this time, and harder. She needed to strike first. "Tell me everything you know about his supply chain," she said, looking up from a column of figures she had copied from the Guild's published trade register. Vance set down his reports. Reginald controls roughly 40% of England's silk imports through his Guild consortium. He buys raw silk from Mediterranean traders operating out of Naples and Marseille, ships it through the Strait of Gibraltar, and brings it into Southampton on contracted vessels. From Southampton, the silk moves inland through the same canal network your family built, which, until this week, he expected to own. What else does he trade? In the last 18 months, he has expanded heavily into winter commodities: tea from the East India routes, cinnamon, cloves, and black pepper from Ceylon and the Spice Islands. He purchases futures contracts, buying the goods months before they arrive, locking in a price, and selling at a premium once the winter demand rises. Rosamund pulled a sheet of paper toward her and began writing figures in a neat column. "Futures are a gamble. If the goods arrive on time and the market holds, the profit margins are enormous. But if anything delays delivery, the contracts expire. He pays for goods he cannot sell at the agreed price, and the loss compounds daily." She looked at him across the desk. The firelight caught the sharp line of his jaw and the deep shadows beneath his eyes. He looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. The weariness of a man who had spent years fighting an enemy with more connections and fewer scruples. "How does he ship the winter commodities?" she asked. "A single southern route. His contracted vessels come up from the Mediterranean, through the Bay of Biscay and into the English Channel, then dock at Southampton or Portsmouth. He does not use the eastern ports because the harbour fees at Southampton are lower and his guild connections there give him priority berthing. Rosamund stared at the figures she had written. Then she stood and walked to the large maritime chart that hung on the wall behind Vance's desk. The same style of chart she had seen in Callum's office, with pins and coloured threads marking routes and positions. She traced the southern shipping lane with her finger, following it from the Mediterranean up through the Atlantic coast and into the Channel. "One route," she murmured. "Every egg in one basket."
He has never needed a second option. The Southampton Guild has always given him preferential treatment.
Rosamund turned from the chart.
What about the eastern ports? Port Blackwood specifically?
Vance raised an eyebrow. Port Blackwood is the deepest natural harbour on the eastern coast. It can berth vessels that Southampton cannot handle during low tide. The dockmaster there has been trying to attract major shipping firms for years, but the established guilds keep their business in the south.
Is the long-term pier lease at Port Blackwood currently held by anyone?
Vance paused. Something shifted behind his grey eyes, the slow recognition of where she was leading him. The previous lease expired 8 months ago. The dockmaster has been soliciting bids, but none of the southern firms have shown interest. The lease is open. Rosamund sat back down and pulled the trade register toward her. She ran her finger down a column of dates until she found what she was looking for. The seasonal winter tariff adjustment takes effect at midnight on the 12th. Every commodity entering an English port after that deadline faces double the import duty. Reginald's winter futures contracts are priced based on the current tariff rate. If his ships cannot unload before midnight on the 12th, the duty increase wipes out his profit margin entirely. That is 4 days from now. 4 days, and his ships are still at sea, coming up the southern route. If they arrive at Southampton on schedule, he unloads, pays the current tariff, and sells at his contracted price. Everything works. She folded her hands on the desk. But if Southampton is no longer available to him, if something forces his ships to divert to the eastern coast, he will need a deep-water port to unload before the deadline. Vance leaned forward in his chair. And if we hold the lease at Port Blackwood? His ships have nowhere to go. Every hour they sit at anchor waiting for a berth is an hour closer to the tariff deadline. And once that deadline passes, the numbers collapse. He bought futures at a price that assumes current duties. Double the duty, and he is selling at a loss on every crate. The fire cracked in the grate. Rain hammered against the tall windows. Somewhere below them in the harbour, Vance's own ships rocked gently at their moorings, freshly cleared for inland transport. Vance stood and walked to the chart on the wall. He studied the eastern coastline for a long moment, his finger resting on the small black dot marked Port Blackwood. "The dockmaster's name is Harrington," he said. "I have met him twice at trade assemblies. He is practical and he is hungry for business. But Reginald will have agents watching every port on the coast. The moment we make a move toward Port Blackwood, word will reach London within a day." "Then we leave before dawn," Rosamund said. "Post-chaise, fast horses, no stops except to change teams at the coaching inns. We reach Harrington before Reginald knows we have left Ashenmere." Vance turned from the chart and looked at her. For the first time since she had met him, something close to genuine warmth crossed his face. It was brief and restrained, like sunlight through a crack in heavy curtains, but it was there. "You think like a general," he said. "I think like a woman who was raised in a family that built canals," Rosamund replied. "Pack light, we leave at 4. They left Ashenmere at 10 minutes past 4, while the sky was still black and the harbour below sat quiet beneath a thin layer of fog. The post-chaise was smaller than the brougham they had taken from London, a narrow, yellow-bodied carriage built for speed, with 2 horses in harness and a postilion, rider, mounted on the lead animal instead of a coachman on the box. Vance had arranged for fresh teams to be waiting at 3 coaching inns along the eastern road, each one roughly 20 miles apart. If the roads held and the weather stayed dry, they would reach Port Blackwood by late afternoon. Rosamund climbed into the chaise carrying her leather portfolio and a canvas bag containing a change of clothes, a wool shawl, and a packet of biscuits wrapped in brown paper that the Ashenmere cook had pressed into her hands on the way out. Vance carried nothing except a folded maritime chart and a pocket watch he checked twice before they cleared the estate gates. The first hour passed in darkness and silence. The chaise rattled along the coastal road, then turned inland where the terrain flattened into wide stretches of farmland, still grey with pre-dawn mist. Rosamund watched the landscape through the small side window. Hedgerows, stone walls, the occasional flicker of candlelight from a farmhouse where someone was already awake and tending livestock. Vance broke the silence as the sky began to lighten. "How did you learn the canal business?" Rosamund turned from the window. "My mother." "Your mother held the patents." "She built the system. My grandfather owned the original land rights along the Birmingham Canal corridor, but it was my mother who saw the commercial potential. She negotiated the lock agreements, hired the barge operators, and established the transfer depots that connect the waterways to the road freight networks. By the time I was 14, she had me sitting in on meetings with depot managers and calculating cargo tonnage at the kitchen table after supper." "She sounds formidable." "She was practical. She told me once that men will always underestimate a woman who understands numbers, and that I should let them, because the moment they realize their mistake, it is already too late." Vance looked at her with an expression she could not quite read. She was right. They changed horses at the first coaching inn, a low stone building called the Crossed Keys that sat at a crossroads surrounded by sheep pasture. The innkeeper's wife brought out hot tea in earthenware cups, while the ostlers swapped the lathered horses for a fresh pair. Rosamund drank her tea standing in the yard, watching the sun climb above the tree line and feeling the stiffness in her back from the narrow carriage seat. Vance stood a few feet away, studying his maritime chart against the stable wall. She noticed that he folded it differently from the way most men handled documents, carefully, along the original creases, smoothing each fold with his thumb, as though the paper itself deserved a certain respect. "May I ask you something?" she said. He glanced up. "The reputation, the monster of the seas, you said it came from refusing to join the guild cartel, but a man does not earn that kind of name simply by saying no to a surcharge." Vance folded the chart and slid it into his coat. He was quiet long enough that Rosamund thought he might not answer at all. Then he finished his tea, set the cup on the stable ledge, and spoke while looking at the horses being led into harness. 8 years ago, I inherited Ashenmere from my uncle. The estate was profitable but modest. 6 ships, a small harbour operation, local coastal trade. I wanted to expand into international routes, so I applied to the Guild Council for a deep water trading license. The application required the endorsement of 3 existing guild directors. Reginald was one of them. Reginald was the chairman of the licensing committee. He approved my application on the condition that I join the consortium and pay the 30% surcharge on all inland freight. I refused. He denied my license. So I found another way. I registered my ships under a Crown Naval Reserve charter that allows former military vessels to carry commercial cargo without guild endorsement. It was a legal loophole that had existed since the wars with France, and no one had ever used it for private trade. That must have caused a scandal. It caused a war. The guild directors filed 17 petitions to have my charter revoked. They pressured harbour masters to deny me berthing. They spread rumours that my ships were unsafe, that I ran my crews like a prison hulk, that I had connections to smuggling operations along the French coast. None of it was true, but none of it needed to be. In polite society, a rumour repeated often enough becomes fact. Rosamund set her own cup down. "And you never corrected them?" "What would have been the point? The people who mattered, my captains, my crews, the merchants who shipped with me, they knew the truth. Everyone else could believe whatever made them comfortable." The ostler called out that the fresh horses were ready. Vance offered his hand to help Rosamund back into the chaise, and this time She noticed that he held it a moment longer than strictly necessary before releasing. They rode through the middle of the day with the windows open, warm summer air carrying the scent of hay and wildflowers into the carriage. The countryside changed as they moved east, the gentle rolling hills of the south giving way to flatter marshland and wide estuaries where rivers emptied into the sea. They passed through market towns where merchants sold fish from wooden stalls and women carried baskets of bread on their hips. Church bells marked the hours from gray stone towers that rose above clusters of timber-framed houses. At the second coaching inn, a place called the Red Hart, Rosamund bought a meat pie from the kitchen and split it with Vance while they waited for fresh horses. They ate standing in the courtyard, and for the first time since the banquet, the conversation turned away from business. He asked about her past along the canals, and she asked about the first voyage he ever made as a ship owner. He told her about a crossing to Bordeaux in heavy weather where the cargo shifted and nearly capsized the vessel. She told him about the winter her mother's favorite barge sank in the Birmingham Canal, and they spent 3 days fishing crates of Staffordshire pottery out of the frozen water. He laughed at that. A real laugh, short and rough, as though the sound surprised even him. The chaise rolled on through the afternoon. Port Blackwood was 30 miles ahead, and somewhere behind them on the southern coast, Reginald's ships were cutting through the channel toward a port that would no longer welcome them. Port Blackwood smelled of tar and herring. The town clung to the eastern coastline like a barnacle on a ship's hull. Grey stone buildings packed tightly along narrow lanes that sloped downward toward the harbour, where fishing boats and cargo vessels shared the same dark water. The harbour itself was impressive, a deep natural basin sheltered by 2 long breakwaters built from rough-cut granite blocks that had been there since the previous century. The water inside was calm and deep enough to berth the largest merchant ships in England, and yet most of the moorings sat empty. Port Blackwood had the bones of a great trading port, but none of the business. Rosamund and Vance arrived just before 5 in the afternoon, dusty and stiff from the road. The post-chaise deposited them at the harbour gate, where a painted wooden sign read, Port Blackwood Harbour Authority, established 1762. Beyond the gate, the main wharf stretched out along the waterfront, lined with warehouses that stood mostly shuttered, their loading doors chained and their windows dark. The dockmaster's office occupied the ground floor of a square brick building at the end of the wharf, wedged between a ship chandler's shop and a public house called the Anchor and Bell. A brass nameplate on the door read, Mr. George Harrington, Harbour Master. Vance knocked twice. The door opened almost immediately, as though Harrington had been watching them walk up the wharf from his window. He was a stocky man in his 50s, with a red face, grey side whiskers, and the thick hands of someone who had spent his younger years hauling rope. He wore a wool waistcoat over a linen shirt, with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, and his office behind him was cluttered with charts, tide tables, and stacks of correspondence that had begun to yellow at the edges. "Duke Vance," Harrington said, stepping aside to let them in. "I received your express letter this morning. I will admit, I read it 3 times before I believed it was genuine." "This is my wife, Mrs. Vance," Vance said. "She will be leading the discussion." Harrington's eyebrows rose a fraction, but he recovered quickly and gestured toward 2 chairs facing his desk. The office was warm and close, heated by a small iron stove in the corner. Charts of the eastern coastline covered every wall, and a model ship carved from pale wood sat on the windowsill, its tiny sails made from scraps of canvas. Rosamund sat down and placed her leather portfolio on the desk. "Mr. Harrington, I understand your Deepwater Pier lease has been unoccupied for 8 months. "Closer to 9, Harrington said, settling into his own chair with the heaviness of a man who had grown tired of waiting. "I have written to every major shipping firm on the southern coast. The responses have been polite refusals when they have bothered to respond at all. The Guild Consortium keeps its business in Southampton and Portsmouth. Port Blackwood is too far east, they say, too inconvenient, too far from London. And yet your harbour can berth vessels that draw 18 feet of water," Rosamund said. Southampton silts up at low tide and cannot handle anything over 14. Harrington leaned back slightly. You know your harbour, Mrs. Vance. I know my numbers. Your piers can handle 40% more tonnage per berth than Southampton. Your harbour fees are lower because you have no guild surcharge, and your position on the eastern coast puts you 12 hours closer to the Baltic trade routes than any southern port. She opened her portfolio. What you lack is a reliable inland distribution connection. Goods arrive here and sit on your docks because there is no efficient freight route to the manufacturing cities. That has been the difficulty, yes. Rosamund laid out a map of the English canal system, her own hand-drawn copy, annotated with tonnage capacities and transit times along each route. I hold the Crown patents for the inland canal distribution network connecting the eastern counties to Birmingham, Manchester, and London. Every lock, every barge license, every transfer depot on these routes operates under my family's charter. I am prepared to offer Port Blackwood an exclusive connection to that network. Harrington stared at the map. His thick fingers traced the canal routes from the eastern coast inland, following the blue lines she had drawn through the river systems and artificial waterways that linked the ports to the industrial heartland. What exactly are you proposing? He asked. A long-term lease on your deep water piers, 10 years, with an option to extend. In exchange, we guarantee a minimum annual cargo volume through your harbour and grant you a 5% commission on all inland freight that passes from Port Blackwood through our canal system. You become the eastern gateway for the largest combined shipping and distribution operation in England. Harrington was quiet for a long moment. The stove ticked in the corner. Through the window behind him, the empty harbour moorings stretched out along the dark water, waiting. The front door of the office banged open. A tall man in a grey travelling coat strode in, breathing hard, his boots muddy from the road. Behind him stood a shorter man, carrying a leather document case embossed with a familiar crest, the silk moth and crossed spindles of the Ashford trading firm. Mr. Harrington, the tall man said, pulling off his gloves. I am Mr. Graves, representing Lord Reginald Ashford of the Southern Silk Consortium. We are here to discuss a lease arrangement for your deep water facilities. Harrington looked from Graves to Rosamund to Vance. The office suddenly felt very small. Graves reached into his companion's document case and produced a leather purse that clinked heavily when he set it on the desk. Lord Ashford is prepared to offer an immediate cash payment of £2,000 for exclusive use of the Eastern Piers, effective today. No conditions, no percentages. £2,000 in gold on this desk right now. The purse sat between them like a dare. £2,000 was more money than Port Blackwood's harbour had generated in the last 3 years combined. Harrington's eyes lingered on it. Rosamund did not look at the purse. She looked at Harrington. Mr. Harrington, she said calmly, £2,000 is a generous sum. It will sustain your harbour for perhaps 18 months, and then Lord Ashford's lease will expire, his ships will return to Southampton, and Port Blackwood will be empty again. She placed her hand flat on the canal map, still spread across his desk. What I am offering you is not a payment. It is a permanent trade route, year-round cargo, year-round revenue, a reason for every merchant on the eastern coast to bring their business through your harbour for the next decade. Harrington looked at the gold, then he looked at the map, then he looked at the woman sitting across from him, who had just drawn the future of his harbour in blue ink on a sheet of paper. He pushed the leather purse back across the desk toward Mr. Graves. I appreciate Lord Ashford's generosity, Harrington said, but I believe I will take the canals. 2 days passed before Reginald's response arrived. It came in the form of 14 ships. Rosamund was standing on the cliff overlook above Port Blackwood's harbour when she first saw them. The morning was clear and still, the sea flat as a sheet of hammered tin, and the sails appeared on the southern horizon like a row of white teeth rising out of the water. She counted them as they grew larger. Merchant vessels, heavy-hulled and deep-drafted, flying the burgundy pennants of the Ashford Silk Consortium. Vance stood beside her with a brass telescope pressed to his eye. He watched the fleet approach for a full minute before lowering the glass and handing it to Rosamund. 14 vessels, he said. All deep-water traders. They are heading for the channel. Rosamund raised the telescope and focused on the narrow passage between the two granite breakwaters that formed the mouth of Port Blackwood's harbour. The channel was the only way in or out, a strip of deep water roughly 200 yards wide, flanked by the breakwaters on either side and shallow, rocky ground beyond them. Any ship entering or leaving the harbour had to pass through that gap. As she watched, the lead vessel in Reginald's fleet dropped its mainsail and swung broadside across the channel entrance. The second ship followed, anchoring alongside it. Then the third. Within 20 minutes, 6 heavy merchant vessels sat anchored in a staggered line across the mouth of the harbour, their hulls overlapping like a wall of timber and iron. The remaining 8 ships took up positions in the open water beyond the breakwaters, forming a loose semicircle that blocked any approach from the south or east. Vance took the telescope back and studied the formation. They are not armed. These are cargo ships, sitting empty with their holds open. He has sent them here for the sole purpose of blocking the channel. Can they do that legally? The harbour channel is classified as a public navigable waterway. Anchoring in it without a berthing permit violates maritime ordinance, but the enforcement authority belongs to the harbour master, and the only way to compel them to move is through an Admiralty court order, which takes a minimum of 6 days to obtain. Rosamund did the arithmetic in her head. 6 days for a court order. The tariff deadline was in 2 days. By the time any legal remedy could force Reginald's ships to move, the seasonal duties would have doubled, and every futures contract he held would have already collapsed. But so would Vance's ability to bring his own cargo ships into Port Blackwood to unload. He is sacrificing his own fleet, she said. Those 14 ships sitting empty in the channel are costing him anchorage fees and crew wages every hour. He knows he cannot win, so he is making sure we cannot win either. A man drowning will grab the ankle of anyone standing near the water, Vance said. Rosamund lowered herself onto the stone bench that sat at the edge of the overlook. Below her, Harrington was already on the wharf, shouting at a clerk and waving his arms toward the blocked channel. Local fishing boats had pulled up short of the breakwaters, their captains standing on deck and staring at the wall of ships that had suddenly sealed off their harbour. She needed to think. Reginald could not keep 14 ships anchored in the channel forever, but he did not need forever. He only needed 2 days. 2 days of blockade would push them past the tariff deadline, and once the duties doubled, the cost of unloading Vance's goods would eat through their profit margins like rust through iron. Reginald would lose his futures contracts either way, but he would drag them down with him. There had to be another way into the harbour. "I need to see the harbour archives," Rosamund said. Vance looked at her. "What are you looking for?" "Property records, maritime boundary charts, anything that shows the legal borders of the harbour authority's jurisdiction." Harrington kept his archives in a back room behind his office, a cramped, windowless space lined with wooden shelves holding rolls of parchment, bound survey books, and leather folders stuffed with documents dating back to the previous century. The room smelled of dust and old leather, and the only light came from a single oil lamp that Harrington hung from a ceiling hook, while Rosamund began pulling documents from the shelves. She worked for 3 hours. Vance brought her tea at one point, which she drank without looking up from the survey book she was reading. Harrington hovered near the door, answering her occasional questions about harbour boundaries and tidal measurements, with the nervous energy of a man watching someone search for treasure in his own attic. She found it buried in a property conveyance record from 1789. The document was a transfer of coastal land rights from the Port Blackwood Harbour Authority to a private estate holder, a sale conducted 37 years earlier to raise funds for breakwater repairs. The parcel in question was a strip of shallow mudflats along the northern headland, roughly half a mile from the main harbour channel. The mudflats had been considered worthless at the time, too shallow for deep water vessels, too exposed to the northern winds for safe anchorage, and too far from the main wharves to be commercially useful. The estate that had purchased them had changed hands several times since 1789. The most recent transfer, recorded just 3 weeks ago in the county land registry, attached the northern headland property to the newly expanded holdings of the Duke of Ashenmere. Rosamund carried the document out to Vance, who was standing on the wharf watching Reginald's ships sit motionless in the blocked channel. "You own the northern mudflats," she said. Vance took the document and read it. "This was part of the coastal land package my solicitor acquired when we signed the pier lease with Harrington. I did not examine every parcel individually." "The mudflats are private property. They sit outside the Harbour Authority's jurisdiction, which means Reginald's blockade of the public channel has no effect on them. If we can get your cargo ships around the northern headland and across the mudflats, we can reach the docks from the backside of the harbour without ever passing through the main channel." Vance studied the property map attached to the conveyance record. The mudflats curved around the headland in a wide, shallow arc that connected to the inner harbour basin through a narrow tidal creek. "The water over those flats is less than 4 feet deep at low tide," he said. "My cargo ships draw 12 feet. They would run aground before they cleared the headland." Rosamund reached into her portfolio and pulled out a sheet of technical drawings she had carried with her since leaving Ashenmere. The design specifications for the flat-bottomed canal barges that operated under her family's patents. "Your cargo ships cannot cross the mudflats," she said, "but my barges can. We transfer the cargo at sea, outside the breakwaters, from your deep-water vessels onto shallow draft barges. The barges cross the mudflats at high tide, enter the harbour through the tidal creek, and unload at the docks. Reginald's ships sit in the main channel blocking nothing." Vance looked from the drawings to the harbour to the woman standing in front of him, holding the answer in a rolled-up sheet of canal engineering. "When is the next high tide?" he asked. Rosamund glanced at the tide table pinned to Harrington's office wall through the open door. "Tomorrow morning, 6:14. The barges arrived from Ashenmere at 3:30 in the morning. Rosamund had sent word by express rider the previous afternoon, and Vance's harbour master Callum had dispatched 6 flat-bottomed canal barges from the coastal warehouse docks before sunset. They travelled through the night along the shoreline, hugging the coast where the water was calm, each barge crewed by 4 experienced bargemen who had spent their working lives navigating the shallow inland waterways of England. The barges were ugly vessels, wide and square-hulled, built from thick English oak with flat keels that sat barely 2 feet below the waterline even when fully loaded. They had no masts, no sails, and no elegance whatsoever. They were moved by long wooden poles pushed against the riverbed in shallow water and towed by rope in deeper channels. They had been designed for one purpose: to carry heavy cargo through water that would strand any other vessel afloat. Rosamund stood on the northern headland in the dark, wrapped in her wool shawl, watching the barges round the point one by one. The sea was black, except where the moonlight caught the crests of small waves breaking over the mudflats below. She could hear the bargemen calling to each other in low voices, their poles splashing softly as they guided the vessels into position along the outer edge of the shallows. Vance was already out on the water. He had taken a small rowing boat from the harbour an hour earlier and positioned himself beyond the breakwaters, where 3 of his deep-water cargo ships waited at anchor, loaded with tea, cotton, and Madeira wine that needed to reach the docks before the tariff deadline expired at midnight. The cargo ships sat in open water, well clear of Reginald's blockade fleet, which remained anchored across the main channel in a tight line of dark hulls and furled sails. The plan was simple in concept and brutal in its demands on timing. At high tide, the water over the northern mudflats would rise to approximately 5 feet, deep enough for the flat-bottomed barges to cross with a full load, but only for a window of roughly 90 minutes before the tide began to fall again. Within that window, the barges had to travel from the cargo ships to the mudflats, cross the shallows, navigate the narrow tidal creek that connected the backside of the headland to the inner harbour, and reach the docks where Harrington's men would be waiting to unload. 90 minutes, 6 barges, roughly £14,000 worth of cargo. The first light appeared on the eastern horizon at 5:15, a thin grey line separating the sea from the sky. Rosamund could see the shapes of the barges more clearly now, 6 dark rectangles bobbing gently on the water near the headland. Beyond them, the silhouettes of Vance's cargo ships rose against the lightening sky, their tall masts bare and their anchor chains taut. Rosamund checked the tide table she had copied onto a folded card and kept in her cloak pocket. High tide at 6:14. The barges needed to begin loading by 5:30 to have the full window. At 5:25, she saw a lantern flash twice from Vance's rowing boat, the signal to begin. The first barge pulled out from the headland and moved toward the nearest cargo ship. When it pulled alongside the tall vessel, the cargo crew above lowered crates on rope slings over the side. 2 men on the barge guiding each crate down onto the flat deck and securing it with hemp straps. The work was steady and practiced. Callum's bargemen had loaded canal freight 1,000 times before, and the only difference now was the gentle roll of the open sea beneath them instead of still canal water. From the headland, Rosamund watched the loading through Vance's telescope. Each barge took approximately 12 minutes to fill, 8 crates per vessel, stacked too high and lashed flat to keep the center of gravity low. As each barge completed its load, it pulled away from the cargo ship and pulled back toward the mudflats to wait for the tide. By 6 o'clock, all 6 barges were loaded and sitting in a line along the edge of the shallows. The water had been rising steadily, and Rosamund could see the mudflats beginning to disappear beneath a sheet of grey-green sea. Clumps of dark seaweed that had been sitting on exposed sand 10 minutes earlier now floated on the surface, drifting slowly with the incoming current. At 12 minutes past 6, the lead bargeman, a broad man named Crosby with a weathered face and forearms like ship timber, pushed his pole into the mud and tested the depth. He called back to the other barges. The water was 4.5 feet over the flats and still rising. At 6:14 exactly, Crosby pushed off. The first barge slid over the mudflats with a soft hiss as its flat keel skimmed the sandy bottom. The water was shallow enough that the pole found solid ground with every push, and Crosby moved his vessel forward with long, steady strokes, reading the bottom through the murky water the way a blind man reads a familiar path with his cane. Behind him, the other 5 barges followed in single file, each one keeping 10 yards of distance from the vessel ahead. Rosamund descended from the headland and made her way along the rocky shore toward the tidal creek. The creek was a narrow channel cut through the base of the headland by centuries of tidal flow, barely 20 feet wide and lined with mossy stone on both sides. At low tide, it was a muddy ditch. At high tide, it became a navigable passage connecting the backside of the headland to the calm inner waters of the harbor basin. She reached the creek mouth just as Crosby's barge entered it. The vessel barely fit. Its square hull passed between the stone walls with less than 2 feet of clearance on either side, and the bargemen pulled in their poles and used their hands to push off the rocks as they guided the barge through the narrow passage. Water sloshed against the stone and echoed in the enclosed space. One by one, the barges emerged from the creek into the inner harbor. Harrington was waiting on the dock with a crew of 12 men, ropes coiled and loading hooks ready. The first barge bumped against the pilings, and the dock workers swarmed over it, unstrapping crates and hauling them up onto the wharf with the kind of focused urgency that only comes when everyone involved understands exactly what is at stake. From the main channel, Reginald's blockade fleet sat motionless. The captains on those ships would have heard the commotion on the docks, the shouts of the dock workers, the thud of crates being stacked on stone, the creak of rope and timber. Several of them stood on their quarterdecks with telescopes raised, watching Vance's cargo appear on the Port Blackwood wharves as though it had materialized out of thin air. Vance rowed back to the harbor through the tidal creek and climbed onto the dock as the last barge was being unloaded. His coat was damp with spray, and his hair was pushed back from his forehead by the sea wind. He stood beside Rosamund and watched the final crates come off the barges. 48 crates in total, each one stamped with the Ashenmere crest and a destination code for Birmingham, Manchester, or London. 14 ships, Rosamund said, looking out across the harbor at the blockade still sitting uselessly in the main channel. And they could not stop 6 barges and a tide table. Vance said nothing. He reached over and took her hand, briefly, firmly, the way a man grips something he has just realized he does not want to let go of. Then he released it and walked toward Harrington's office to sign the cargo receipts. The tariff deadline was still 18 hours away. Every crate was on English soil. And in the main channel, 14 empty ships rocked gently on the tide, blocking a passage that no longer mattered. The Capital Exchange Hall stood on Threadneedle Street in the heart of London's financial quarter, a columned limestone building with marble floors and a vaulted ceiling painted with scenes of English merchant ships sailing toward distant ports. It was the kind of building designed to remind everyone inside it that commerce was the true engine of the empire, and the men who controlled it deserved architecture to match their ambitions. Rosamund had been inside the exchange hall once before, at the age of 16, when her mother had brought her to observe a quarterly guild session from the public gallery. She remembered sitting in the upper balcony, watching rows of men in dark coats argue over tariff schedules and harbor fees, and her mother leaning over to whisper, "Remember their faces. One day you will sit at that table." Today, she sat at that table. The quarterly meeting of the High Guild Council drew representatives from every major trading house in England. 43 guild directors occupied the curved wooden benches that lined the main chamber, arranged in tiers like a small amphitheater facing the raised platform where the council chairman presided. The gallery above was packed with clerks, solicitors, and merchants who lacked voting seats, but whose livelihoods depended on every decision made in this room. Rosamund and Vance had arrived in London the previous evening after 2 days of hard travel from Port Blackwood. They had taken rooms at a quiet inn near Cheapside, and Rosamund had spent the night organizing her documents at a writing desk by candlelight, while Vance met with his London shipping agent to confirm that the cargo unloaded at Port Blackwood was already moving inland through the canal network. The first barges had reached the Birmingham transfer depot that morning. The system was working. Reginald was already in the chamber when they entered. He sat in the third row of benches on the left side, wearing a burgundy coat with gold buttons and the silk cravat of a guild director pinned with his family crest. His face had changed since the banquet. The easy confidence had been replaced by something tighter, a controlled tension around his jaw and eyes that made him look older than his 34 years. Cecilia was not with him. Rosamund noticed that detail and filed it away without comment. The chairman, Lord Pemberley, called the session to order at 10 o'clock sharp. He was a large man with a white beard and a voice that filled the chamber without effort, and he moved through the preliminary business: harbor fee adjustments, a licensing dispute in Bristol, a report on Baltic grain imports, with the brisk efficiency of someone who had chaired these meetings for 20 years and intended to be finished by luncheon. The fourth item on the agenda was listed as Review of Outstanding Futures Contracts, Lord Ashford, Southern Silk Consortium. Pemberley read the item aloud and looked toward the third row. Lord Ashford, the Council has received reports that several of your winter commodity futures remain unfulfilled past the seasonal tariff deadline. You hold the floor. Reginald stood. He clasped his hands behind his back and addressed the chamber with a voice that was steady but carried an undertone of strain, like a rope pulled close to its breaking point. My Lord Chairman, the delays in fulfilling my winter contracts were caused by extraordinary circumstances beyond my control. My supply fleet was unable to access its designated unloading port due to a series of commercial maneuvers by the Duke of Ashenmere and his wife, who deliberately acquired exclusive berthing rights at an eastern harbor with the specific intention of denying my vessels access. Murmurs rippled through the chamber. Pemberley raised a hand for quiet. "Furthermore," Reginald continued, "my fleet's attempt to utilize alternative harbor facilities was obstructed when the same parties exploited a private land conveyance to bypass standard harbor channels, undermining the integrity of our shared maritime infrastructure." Rosamund listened without expression. Vance sat beside her with his arms folded, watching Reginald the way he watched everything, with patient, measured stillness. Pemberley turned to them. "Mrs. Vance, the Council is aware that you hold relevant canal patents and that your husband's shipping firm is party to the matters Lord Ashford describes. Do you wish to respond?" Rosamund stood. She carried a single leather folder, thinner than the portfolio she had brought to every previous encounter. She had learned by now that the more prepared she was, the fewer documents she needed. "My Lord Chairman, I will address Lord Ashford's claims in order. First, the berthing lease at Port Blackwood was acquired through a standard commercial negotiation with the harbour master, Mr. George Harrington. Lord Ashford's representative was present during that negotiation and made a competing offer, which Mr. Harrington declined. There was nothing extraordinary about the process. Lord Ashford was simply outbid." She opened her folder and removed a single sheet of paper. "Second, the private land conveyance Lord Ashford references is a legally registered property transfer recorded in the County Land Registry. The Northern Headland mudflats are private property belonging to the Duke of Ashenmere. Their use for cargo transport does not fall under Harbour Authority jurisdiction and therefore does not constitute an obstruction of maritime infrastructure." She placed the property record on the table in front of Pemberley, who examined it briefly and nodded. "Third, and most critically, I would like to direct the Council's attention to the matter of Lord Ashford's outstanding futures contracts." She removed a second document from her folder. "This is a summary of Lord Ashford's winter commodity positions, compiled from publicly available Guild trading records. Lord Ashford purchased futures contracts for tea, cinnamon, cloves and black pepper, totaling approximately £41,000 in anticipated value. These contracts were purchased on credit extended by the Guild Reserve Fund, secured against the projected revenue from his silk import operations." The chamber had gone very quiet. Reginald's hands, still clasped behind his back, tightened visibly. The seasonal tariff deadline passed at midnight 2 days ago. Lord Ashford's supply vessels remained anchored in the Port Blackwood Channel throughout that period, unable to unload. His goods are now subject to the doubled import duty, which reduces his margin on every contract below the break-even point. He cannot fulfill his obligations to his buyers at the contracted price, and he cannot repay the credit he drew from the Guild Reserve Fund. She looked directly at Reginald. Lord Ashford financed his futures contracts with unbacked credit. He gambled on a single supply route, a single port, and the assumption that no competitor would ever challenge his monopoly. Every one of those assumptions has failed. Pemberley leaned forward. "Lord Ashford, is the outstanding credit balance confirmed?" Reginald's solicitor, seated behind him, leaned forward and whispered something in his ear. Reginald listened, then straightened and spoke in a voice that had lost all its earlier composure. "The credit balance is currently under review." "The balance is £41,000, Rosamund said. "It is not under review, it is unpaid." The chamber erupted. Guild directors turned to each other, voices rising in sharp bursts of alarm and calculation. £41,000 of unbacked credit threatened the stability of the entire Guild Reserve Fund, and every man in the room understood what that meant for their own accounts. Pemberley struck his gavel 3 times. When the chamber quieted, he spoke in a voice heavy with the gravity of a man delivering a verdict he had hoped to avoid. "The Council has no choice but to act in the interest of market stability. Lord Ashford, your Guild directorship is hereby suspended pending a full audit of your trading accounts. Your consortium assets will be frozen and placed under Council receivership until all outstanding debts are resolved." Reginald sat down. He did not speak again for the remainder of the session. Rosamund closed her folder and returned to her seat beside Vance. In the gallery above, 40 clerks were already composing letters to their employers describing what had just happened. By evening, every trading house in London would know that Lord Reginald Ashford's commercial empire had collapsed in the time it took a woman to read 2 documents aloud. The liquidation took 3 days. Reginald's consortium assets were catalogued, appraised, and put to auction under the supervision of the Guild Council's appointed receivers. His silk warehouses in Southampton were sold first, followed by his fleet contracts, his harbour leases, and his shares in 3 subsidiary trading firms that had operated under the Ashford name for nearly a decade. The auction drew buyers from every corner of England's merchant class, each one eager to pick up premium commercial assets at a fraction of their former value. Vance acquired the largest portion. His agents purchased Reginald's southern harbour leases, his Mediterranean shipping contracts, and the controlling interest in the silk import operation that had been the foundation of the Ashford fortune. The transactions were completed quietly, without fanfare, through sealed bids submitted to the council receivers by Vance's London solicitor. By the time the final gavel fell, the Duke of Ashenmere controlled more commercial shipping tonnage than any private citizen in England. Rosamund handled the inland side. She used the canal network to absorb Reginald's former distribution clients, offering them lower transit fees and faster delivery times through the integrated system she and Vance had built. Within 48 hours of the auction's close, every major textile merchant in Birmingham and Manchester had signed new freight agreements routing their goods through the Vance-Hargrove Canal network. The lock operators and barge crews who had worked under her family's patents for years barely noticed the change. The cargo simply increased, the schedules tightened, and the revenue began to climb. On the evening of the 15th day since the Capital Trade Banquet, Rosamund sat in the garden of Vance's London townhouse on a wrought iron bench beneath a pergola covered in climbing roses. The garden was small by aristocratic standards, a walled rectangle of gravel paths and flower beds tucked behind a Georgian terrace house on a quiet square near St. James's. The air smelled of late summer, warm stone, cut grass, and the faint sweetness of roses that had been blooming since June and were only now beginning to drop their petals onto the gravel below. She had changed out of the dark travelling clothes she had worn for the better part of 2 weeks, and put on a pale blue evening dress that had been delivered from a dressmaker on Bond Street that afternoon. It was the first new garment she had worn since the banquet, and the fabric felt strange against her skin, too soft, too clean, after days of wool shawls and dusty carriage seats and harbour spray. Vance appeared through the garden door carrying 2 glasses of wine and a leather document case under his arm. He had bathed and changed into a clean dark coat, though his hair was still slightly damp at the temples, and his boots were the same scuffed pair he wore everywhere. He set the glasses on the small iron table beside the bench and sat down next to her. The evening light was golden and low, casting long shadows across the gravel. Somewhere beyond the garden wall, a church bell struck 7, and the sound hung in the warm air before fading into the murmur of the city. "I have something for you," Vance said. He opened the document case and removed a folded contract written on heavy cream parchment. The script was formal, drafted by his solicitor in the careful, precise language of English commercial law, and the Ashenmere crest was pressed into the wax seal at the bottom of the final page. Rosamund took the document and began reading. She read slowly, the way she always did with contracts, following each clause with her finger and pausing at the terms that mattered. The contract was a revised partnership agreement. It replaced the informal business pact they had made in the carriage on the road to Ashenmere 2 weeks earlier. The new terms were comprehensive. They covered the shipping fleet, the canal network, the harbour leases at both Ashenmere and Port Blackwood, the Mediterranean trade routes, the newly acquired Ashford assets, and every subsidiary operation that fell under the combined enterprise. The final clause stopped her. She read it twice, then looked up at Vance. 50%, she said. "Equal ownership," Vance replied. every vessel, every route, every warehouse, every contract. Half is yours, not as a concession, not as a favor, because the enterprise does not function without you, and any contract that pretends otherwise would be a lie. Rosamund held the document in her lap and stared at the garden wall. A climbing rose had pushed its way through a crack in the old brick and was blooming in a spray of pale pink flowers that caught the last of the evening light. She had spent so many years protecting what she had, guarding her patents, managing her mother's legacy, holding together a commercial inheritance that everyone around her had tried to absorb, diminish, or steal, that the idea of someone simply offering her an equal share felt like stepping onto solid ground after a long time at sea. "You could have written this contract to give me 20% and I would have signed it," she said. "I know. You could have given me 30 or even 40 and I would have considered it more than fair. I know that as well." She looked at him. His grey eyes were steady, the way they always were, but there was something behind them tonight that she had not seen before, an openness, unguarded and deliberate, as though he had made a decision to let her see the full depth of what he was offering and was prepared to accept whatever she decided. "Why 50?" she asked. Vance picked up his glass of wine but did not drink from it. He turned it slowly in his hand, watching the last sunlight catch the dark surface of the liquid. "Because 2 weeks ago I signed a marriage registry with a woman I had never spoken to before that evening. I did it because she offered me something I needed, and I am practical enough to recognize a good transaction when one presents itself." He paused. "But somewhere between the customs hearing and Port Blackwood, between the coaching inns and the tide table, and the look on Harrington's face when you spread that canal map across his desk, this stopped being a transaction." He set the glass down and looked at her directly. "I do not wish to own a share of your life, Rosamund. I wish to stand beside it, and the only contract that reflects that honestly is an equal one." The garden was quiet. The church bell had stopped. The roses dropped another petal onto the gravel, and the shadows of the pergola stretched long and soft across the path. Rosamund picked up the pen that Vance had placed on the table beside the document case. It was the same fountain pen he had used to sign the marriage registry at the banquet. She recognized the dark wood barrel and the silver nib. She uncapped it and signed her name on the line beside his, her handwriting steady and clear on the cream-colored parchment. She set the pen down and placed her hand over his on the bench between them. His fingers closed around hers, warm, firm, unhurried. "Equal partners," she said. "Equal partners," he repeated. They sat together in the fading light while London hummed beyond the garden wall. Carriages on cobblestones, the distant cry of a newspaper seller, the soft clatter of a city settling into its evening rhythm. Behind them, inside the townhouse, the signed contract lay open on the table where the ink was still drying. Ahead of them, a merchant empire waited. Harbors and canals, ships and barges, tea and silk and cotton moving across a nation through a system built by two people who had started with nothing between them except a shared understanding that the world belonged to those who refused to be underestimated. Rosamund leaned her shoulder against his, just slightly, and watched the first star appear above the rooftops. She thought of her mother and the kitchen table and the columns of numbers that had taught her everything she knew. She thought of the banquet and the 300 faces staring at her as she crossed the ballroom floor toward a man everyone feared. She had walked toward him expecting a business arrangement. She had found something far better.